So yeah, first of all, I'm Dominic Weeks. I'm head of technology and digital at Madano, which is an insights-led communications consultancy. And this is my colleague, Darren Fleetwood, who is research director at Madano. What we want to talk to you today about is one of the ways in which we think marketing is currently broken and on slightly the wrong track. And we're going to argue, essentially, ties very neatly into some of the things that Mark was talking about the lure of Facebook and Google and the continuation of spend ploughing in there in spite of mistrust. So thank you to Mark in the previous session for setting the scene. But we're going to argue that the lure of that advanced targeting capability has really meant that too many strategies essentially are not broad enough in focus and don't take into account the attitudes and aspirations of a broad sway of the population, and that there are a number of inherent dangers in doing that. We're also going to argue that advanced analytics really needs to be used to consider the bigger picture and not kind of just micro targeting. So, we're going to set out exactly what that means for strategy, for how you deploy across different channels, and how that builds a stronger rationale for doing so. So, first of all, I mean, key metaphor that kind of in thinking about what we were going to talk through that jumped out to me is, what if we can no longer for the trees, which was always one of my father's favorite metaphors to go back to. But what if we were so focused on one individual target or one individual segment that we really can't see how things are developing across a wider ecosystem? And I'm sure that many of our fellow attendees are marketers that understand the value of brand building, understand the value of a multi-channel approach, reaching customers in different ways. It was really interesting to hear Pablo's talk about customer experience and the various touch points about when you needed to reach out to people. But at the same time, there's obviously a hugely tight control and pressure on spend. And the focus on ROI is ever increasing. So again, to go back to some of the brilliant stats that Mark pulled out, Facebook and Google and programmatic as well, programmatic display, do see increasing spend all the time, and it's very easy to understand why. That spend marches on ever and ever into their deep pockets. Because at the end of the day, what's not to like to a certain degree? It's brilliant for meeting intent where it lies. The efficacy of the spend is there. It's hard to beat PPC for that, or even a laser targeted social ad. And I think many of the marketers who are involved in door drop and direct over the years will understand that the appeal of a very closely defined return on investment on spend, so it's understandable that it leads to this kind of pressure. But the net result is really that brand managers and their agencies have ever more incentive really just to see the audiences as a dichotomy. It's those that will act and it's those that will not. And of course, where will you target? Where will you focus your time and energy? It's on those that you consider to be potential buyers, now or in the short term. So yeah, and if you talk to a recruitment consultant now about a role that they're trying to fill for a kind of big brand CMO, the CVs that they are looking for and the people they want to talk to are the performance marketing rock stars and all stars. But we see a potential danger, and we see a potential Faustian bargain here. If you're focusing on hyper-targeted content across a small number of channels, users' online data, it can help make a small percentage convert and repeat. But what about that larger percentage that never does? What impact have you had on them? And even more than that, what's going on with the broad wide populace and how they view your brand? So that needs to really be focused on. Where's the effort to engage new supporters? That's kind of the first question that we wanted to address. So the more focus that's put onto meeting highly specific personas on the optimal channel, all of a sudden the marketing team and agency is just spending the majority of its time focused on that segment, and you're not evangelizing to a wider audience. And so what are those three key dangers that are inherent in that? So the first in our mind is that core audiences and what they want really do shift over time. So it's not a fixed object. So take, for example, an automotive OEM in the United States. In the 50s, they were probably focused on meeting their audience needs in terms of space and comfort. In the 80s, it became about raw power and style. And then, over the next decade, it's probably around net zero and electrification. So it's not just the general population, the general attitudes of a population that change. It's also that brands' core personas and audiences change over time. So Malcolm Gladwell famously identified Hush Puppies as a brand that kind of went out and by accident or organically found a completely new audience at one of its lowest ebbs, and therefore transformed and became incredibly powerful brand again. And I think you could also think about the British shoe brand Clarks, which sort of meandered its way into hip hop culture unknowingly. And again, you could see those as accidents and being kind of organic spreads. But you've got to admit there's no doubt an opportunity to miss things and miss the opportunity to expand into new segments if you are not focused in wider populations and considering how people view the brand. There's also a huge business continuity risk and a brand safety danger. If you're paying attention only to a really, really narrow set of stakeholders, can you actually see emerging detractors? Can you see those who oppose the brand? Or can you see those that are kind of quietly supportive advocates drifting away and losing their affection for the brand? And it raises a question as to when things are good, then it's not a massive concern. But if you're not building brand equity with a wide audience, if you're only building it with a narrow band of transactional customers who are responsive to e-commerce, responsive to PPC, that equity is very transactional. So who will be there and where will be this favorable sentiment if things for any reason do kind of go in the wrong direction or you have a crisis? And then thirdly, I think the other area we find interesting is that creativity actually has every chance of suffering as well. So in a narrow performance marketing only focused paradigm, you're probably looking at very few channels. You're looking at very few targets. And yes, data can be the bedrock of an excellent campaign. But for creativity to really come through, you need the brand to have connections. You need to have a range of sources and a range of inputs. And by focusing on just squeezing those marginal gains of what to work, do you, in some respects, does it become staid and transactional? And for sure, there'll be an over-reliance on a handful of those channels and formats, which reduce the opportunity for people to see, reduce the overall footprint of a brand. But I also think there is a knock-on impact in terms of the general creative shaping of a campaign when you're not pulling in more insight from outside, from a wider audience. And more than anything, isn't the most disappointing thing here that we've given up on the ones that got away? So this trend of neglecting brand in favor of chasing metrics is both really quite short term in its outlook, but it also represents a bit of a white flag of surrender for mass market marketing campaigns. Has the ambition gone out the window to try and convert new buyers, to try and win over new audiences, to sell a dream almost? And of course, brands and products, they can't be all things to all people. And so, we do need to target campaigns. We do need to use data very effectively to do that. But an effort to persuade more people to enter the pool of potential buyers seems like a smart business strategy, and one that seems to be increasingly neglected. So we really feel that it requires a broader understanding of a wider audience and thinking through what that understanding means in terms of how you reach them in different ways. It means brands are not sticking their head at the moment. Brands are not sticking their heads above the parapet to look at what's really going on in the world, and they're not thinking about how those macro events or macro attitudes are influencing audiences and stakeholders. So is perhaps because at Madano, most of our work is focused on persuading people of either complex issues or trying to change minds, that this is where we kind of approach it from. We're not as focused on all the time on the tipping point of a purchase and converting that. But we do focus on attitudes and understanding attitudes and sentiments of a wide range of stakeholders to ensure effective communications and an effective communication strategy. So doing that is all about how to understand how perceptions are changing, who drives that change and why. And ultimately, it's about building a wider coalition of support for your brand over time that can expand a narrow audience, can win over supporters, and it can help support when there's a diminishing customer set in any in any area. But what we're not talking about here is going back to the very standard focus group and finger in the air in a conference room, blue sky thinking of, okay, we should do a general campaign about X, Y, and Z. We're talking about using advanced analytics to establish a deeper understanding of that wider audience. We're considering that a crucial part to a long-term brand strategy. What are the undercurrents of opinion that are out there? How is the way your business is touching the world changing, and how do people view that? And what are the tensions between different groups and who is influencing them? What are those big issues that are emerging, and how are you going to approach that? What does that mean for the various different channels that you use and the messages that you send? So Darren is now going to take you through an example of what some of this thinking looks like in practice.
Great, thanks, Dom. And really what we're asking for here is a bit of a shift in perspective, which really reinforces what quite serendipitously Pablo finished with, which was listening more to our customers. So really re-engaging with their motivations, their attitudes, their behaviors, but also paying attention to the wider context and the issues that are emerging within there. So for me as a researcher, what this means is measuring the right things. And getting measurement right. So, for example, with the clicks and the sales and the click-throughs that are really in the foreground of performance marketing, the dial just moves too slowly to be able to capture this wider context. If an issue is already affecting your purchase or purchase intention, it's too late and too late to address that. So what we need is research and measurement that really allows us to be more agile and really be more responsive to our environment. So I think that means dusting off our brand trackers, our horizon scanning pieces, but it also means that, as Dom was mentioning, we can repurpose some of the kind of the techniques that or the advanced analytics that Google and Facebook are using for targeting to get this wider perspective, and that's been part of what we've been doing at Madano. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to use circular economy, and I think we're going to use it because it's a great example of the kind of issue that presents the risks that Dom's been talking about. It's also something we've researched recently, which is quite convenient. So the circular economy is really about designing out waste and designing out pollution from our processes and the wider economy by keeping products and materials in use as much as possible. So, for example, with recycling, and in doing so, regenerating the environment. And really the end vision here is an economy that's self-sustaining, so minimizes the inputs and minimizes the waste. This is something that's really emerged over the last few years as a concept, and it has really formed into such. So there are NGOs specifically looking at this issue, but it's probably fair to say it hasn't broken into the mainstream yet. But it is something that's really rapidly gaining interest. So we've seen, for example, a 4-fold increase in the number of Google searches around the topic over the last 5 years, which was also something that we saw in our wider research. And really, looking at the issue, I mean, the scope is the entire economy. So brands and policymakers across all sectors, particularly if this keeps the momentum it's got, are going to be asked how they're contributing to this circular economy, with fairly obvious, I think, reputational risks and opportunities. And we've already seen this in our research that we've done, particularly around the sectors that are already in the firing line, so tech and FMCG, that I'll touch on slightly later. This is also an issue that's gaining a lot of interest in policy circles. So we've seen a number of legislative battles recently that are really central to this notion of the circular economy. So, for example, the right to repair bills that have recently been passed in the US and the EU, which really affirm customers' rights to be able to repair their products. So this is an issue that both has reputational risks and legislative risks as well. So if we could go on to the next slide, Dom. I'm not going to talk too much around the specifics of the research. I'm just going to present a couple of key findings that are relevant to the discussion today. I'm happy to take any questions on it. But we looked at media and social media, or all media and social media content around the issue over the last 18 months. So that's just over 350,000 posts and articles. And really what we were trying to do was tease out what the key topics and trends are and understand who the big players are who are driving that discussion. So what we found was that, I mean, at a really broad level, and apart from the brands and the NGOs and professionals who are engaging with the issue, there are really two types of consumers. The guys on the left are really part of a movement that is advocating, and I think it's true to say a movement that's advocating on behalf of circular economy, particularly asking for change towards legislators and brands, and especially around the right to repair. So these are people who really want to live the circular economy through their actions by fixing their own stuff. They are what we often see in this kind of emerging issue. So they're a really small group, but very sophisticated and very vocal. So they make up about 15 to 20% of the people, but the vast majority of the posts. And then by contrast, the guys on the right are sustainable consumers. So they engage with the circular economy, but mainly as a wider desire to lead a sustainable lifestyle. So they really want to be reassured that the products that they're buying reflect these sustainable values that they hold. It's probably fair to say they're a lot less sophisticated around circular economy as a concept than the first guys, and only occasionally engage with the issue, but they're much larger group of consumers. So what are the risks of a targeting-led approach here? Well, we may well do we may well fall into the trap that Dom mentioned earlier of mainly talking to the small vocal minority. So for example, if we optimized for people already engaging the issue, we probably would have reached largely the group on the left who are already those activists. And the problem here is not just, I think, the missed opportunity of engaging with that larger group of consumers. It's that the guys on the left are really antagonistic towards brands. So they've got a really important role to play within a campaign in terms of they lead the discussion around the issue, but they're probably not going to be the people who buy our products. I think you'll also notice that there are very different motivations. We're still on the previous slide, Dom. You'll also notice that there are still, very different motivations between the two groups. So for the guys on the left, it's really about empowering them to live through the circular economy themselves, whereas the guys on the right, really want brands to live those ambitions for them, or it's probably truer to say live those ambitions through brands and the products that they're buying. So we need different messaging to connect with the two groups. They're very different. And they're going to play different roles in a campaign, which may well be something we could have hypothesized, but probably would have missed. And there would have been a danger of really getting the messaging wrong without taking this broader perspective. Great, we can move on now. So the last thing we wanted to touch on is when we looked at how brands were performing in the issue, particularly around the types of engagements that they were getting. So the brands that did well were the ones that are able to combine tangible actions, so things like bottle recycling schemes, removing charges from electronics boxes, with really an overall sustainability vision and long-term commitments. So things like net zero commitments. And they constantly reinforced the link between the two in what was a really clear strategy. Where this was missing, where brands didn't do this, which I think is probably fair to say the majority that we came across, I'm not going to name any names, but the actions really came across as piecemeal or even contradictory in some cases. So particularly tech brands, I think, are struggling around this. And quite a few were supporting the right to repair and taking actions there, while at the same time challenging legislation around the issue. And what this meant is when they tried to talk on to introduce other messaging, so for example around net zero, it was much more difficult to land because they just lost that credibility and trust with consumers. By contrast, the brands that did manage to connect, I mean, aside from the kind of the reputational gains, they were much better able to weather the storms and those kind of inevitable criticism that they're going to get, and because they built that trust and credibility, and they had that long legacy of actions that they were able to point to when those inevitable challenges came up. And we saw actually, again, naming no names, but some of the FMCG brands were doing this really well, and had a lot less criticism around their weak spots, for example, plastic pollution and that kind of thing, than a lot of the other brands that hadn't connected with this idea so well. And really, what brings it back to our argument is they managed to do this by preemptively addressing the issue. And in doing so, really gaining control of that conversation before this even would have been on the radar of performance marketing measures. And again, may well have been something that was missed if we hadn't taken this broader perspective. So I'm going to hand back to Dom, who's going to sum up.
Yeah, and I think that this is a particularly interesting example of the overall premise we were talking through at the start, in that it's an emerging issue, as Darren alluded to. It's not yet kind of really found its way into mainstream consciousness, but has a huge impact on how consumers will respond to brands over the coming years. And it's, again, as Darren said, it's not one that you can necessarily identify from immediate interactions with the existing audience. And it's been really interesting through COVID-19 for us, because we have seen, many clients, I guess it's a bit of a split, but many clients say they want to push more of their spend into performance to try and get through a tough time. But we've also seen many realizing that building trust and building a deeper connection is really important as they try and navigate this. And it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out over time. But our belief across this case study Darren's kind of talked through, but then also across various different issues where we're conducting this research, is there's huge amounts of value to be added by generating that general understanding.